January 17th, 1863. Fort McLean, New Mexico Territory. The old chief rode slowly toward the American soldiers, his massive frame hunched against the bitter cold. At over 70 years old, Mangus Coloradas still cut an imposing figure. 6 feet 4 inches tall, he towered above most men of his time. His people called him Red Sleeves, a name earned decades earlier when his arms ran red with the blood of his enemies. But tonight, wrapped in a blanket against the freezing desert wind, he carried no weapons, only a white flag. His breath crystallized in the moonlit air as his horse picked its way down the rocky slope. Behind him, hidden among the dark pines of the Burro Mountains, other Apache warriors watched. They had begged him not to go. Cochise, his son-in-law, had warned him this was suicide. But Mangus believed he had no choice. 5 months earlier, a bullet had torn through his chest at Apache Pass. An American soldier named John Teal had shot him from behind a dead horse as Mangus charged forward on foot, a giant among his warriors. The Apache had ridden through the night, carrying their wounded chief 120 miles to Llanos, Mexico, where a terrified doctor operated at gunpoint. The Apache told the doctor, "If Mangus dies, everyone in this town dies." The doctor's hands had been steady. Mangus lived. But the Battle of Apache Pass had been a disaster. 200 Apache warriors against 95 American soldiers should have been a massacre. It should have been easy. The spring in the pass was the only water for 40 miles. Any wagon train, any military column had to stop there. The Apache had hidden in the rocks above, waiting. They had the high ground. They had the numbers. They had surprise. Then, the Americans brought out their howitzers. The cannon fire tore through the Apache positions, exploding against rocks and sending razor-sharp fragments of stone through flesh. Warriors who had never retreated from anything ran from those thundering guns. Mangus himself fell, the bullet in his chest, stealing his breath, stealing his strength. The Apache had dragged him away as the Americans secured the spring and continued their march. Now, months later, his chest still ached with every breath. The wound had healed, but something else had broken inside him. For the first time in his long life, Mangus Coloradas understood a terrible truth. The Apache could not win this war. The Americans had too many guns, too many soldiers, too many of those howitzer cannons that could destroy rock itself. And they kept coming, an endless river of pale faces flowing west, building their forts, killing the game, taking the land. Mangus had fought the Mexicans for 40 years. He had earned his name, Red Sleeves, by killing so many near the Santa Rita copper mines that locals fled by the hundreds. He had driven the Spanish away. He had outlasted them all. But these Americans were different. So he had made his decision. He would negotiate. He would find a way for his people to survive, even if it meant surrender, even if it meant reservation life, which the Apache despised more than death itself. At least there would be a future. At least the children would live. He approached the American camp. Soldiers raised their rifles. Mangus raised his white flag higher. Brigadier General Joseph West stepped forward. They had met before, through translators, each man speaking past the other, neither truly understanding. West invited him to parley. Mangus dismounted. They talked. West seemed receptive, or so it appeared through the imperfect translation. Then West gave an order. Soldiers seized Mangus. They took his white flag. They bound his wrists. That night, they placed him near a fire under guard. 2 soldiers watched him. It was bitterly cold, that January night, under stars that glittered like ice crystals in the black New Mexico sky. The desert cold seeped into old bones, into old wounds. Mangus wrapped himself in a thin blanket and lay on the frozen ground. The guards grew bored. They heated their bayonets in the fire until the metal glowed red. Then they prodded the old chief's legs, his feet, burning him through the blanket. Mangus endured it in silence. He was Apache. He had taught young warriors how to withstand torture. He would not give these soldiers the satisfaction of hearing him scream. But when they pressed the searing metal against his feet again, he finally spoke. His voice was steady, commanding. He told them, through gritted teeth, that he was not a child to be played with. The soldiers raised their rifles and shot him twice. A third soldier walked over to the fallen body and fired once more through the back of his head. In the morning, they scalped him. They cut off his head and boiled it in a large pot. The skull was packed in a crate and shipped east to a phrenologist named Orson Fowler in New York City, who measured it and declared it had no equal in size. The body was thrown into a shallow gully and partially buried. When the Apache discovered what had been done, their rage was beyond words. Geronimo would later call it, quote, perhaps the worst wrong ever done to the Indians, end quote. The Apache believed a person goes to the afterlife in the state they died. Mangus Coloradas, the greatest Apache war chief who ever lived, would walk the spirit world forever without his head. The Americans thought they had ended the Apache resistance by murdering their greatest leader. Instead, they had guaranteed 25 more years of brutal warfare. They had ensured that every Apache from every band would fight to the last breath rather than trust American promises of peace. But this murder was not the beginning. For the Apache, the war of extermination had already been raging for over a century. It came from three directions at once. From the south, Mexico offered bounties for Apache scalps and sold Apache children into slavery. From the east, the Comanche waged what the Spanish called a war of extermination, driving the Apache from the plains. And from the north, the Americans arrived with their manifest destiny, their howitzer cannons, and their belief that the only good Indian was a dead Indian. This is the story of how three empires tried to erase the Apache from existence, how they nearly succeeded, and how a people refused to die. Welcome to Valor and Violence. To understand how the Apache came to face extinction, you must first understand the world they inhabited and the enemies that surrounded them on all sides. The Apache were not one unified nation, but a collection of bands spread across a vast territory. The Chiricahua roamed southern Arizona and New Mexico. The Mescalero held the mountain ranges of south-central New Mexico. The Lipan ranged across western Texas. The Jicarilla occupied northern New Mexico. The Western Apache controlled central Arizona. Each band had its own chiefs, its own customs, its own territory, but they shared a language, a culture, and a way of life that had sustained them for centuries. By the 1850s, perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 Apache remained. Maybe more, maybe less. No one had ever counted them, and they had no interest in being counted. They moved constantly, following game and raiding their enemies. They were semi-nomadic, knowing every spring, every canyon, every cave in their territory. This knowledge made them nearly impossible to track. An Apache could disappear into landscape where a white man or Mexican would die of thirst within days. Their strength lay not in numbers, but in their mastery of guerrilla warfare. They could cover 70 miles a day on foot, through terrain that broke horses and killed men. They could hide in plain sight, camouflaged so perfectly that John Cremeny, who spent years among them and wrote the book Life Among the Apaches, described watching an Apache warrior literally disappear behind a bush, barely large enough to hide a rabbit. The man had buried himself under grass and dirt within seconds, invisible even from a few feet away. But this mastery of survival would be tested as never before, when three great powers decided the Apache had to be destroyed. The first enemy came from the south. The Spanish had arrived in the 1600s with their metal armor, their guns, their horses, and their absolute conviction that they had the right to conquer everything they saw. By the 1700s, they controlled Mexico and pushed north into Apache territory. The Apache responded by raiding Spanish settlements, stealing horses, and killing anyone who resisted. For a time, the Spanish tried to pacify the Apache with rations. They built presidios, military forts, and offered food in exchange for peace. Many Apache, tired of warfare, accepted. They lived outside the presidios, sent their children to Spanish schools, even took Spanish names and converted to Catholicism. But when Mexico won independence from Spain in 1821, everything changed. The new Mexican government was broke. Revolutionary wars consumed resources, and the young nation had none to spare. The rations to the Apache were cut back, then cut again, then stopped entirely. The Apache, who had been promised food and protection in exchange for peace, found themselves betrayed. They returned to their old ways. They returned to raiding. The Mexican response was brutal and escalatory. In 1835, the government of Chihuahua instituted a scalp bounty, 100 pesos for every adult Apache male scalp. Additional bounties were offered for captured women and children who were sold into slavery. Mercenaries and manhunters flocked to the borderlands, eager to collect. The most infamous incident came in 1837 near the Santa Rita copper mines. An American mercenary named John Johnson, hired by the Mexican government, invited a group of 50 Apache to his camp. Their leader was Juan Jose Campa, a man who had been educated in Mexican schools and worked for years to maintain peace. Johnson offered them gifts, flour, and liquor. While the Apache feasted and drank, Johnson's men surrounded them. Without warning, they opened fire with a hidden swivel cannon and rifles. Juan Jose died instantly. 20 others fell in the first volley. Among those who escaped was a warrior who would take Juan Jose's place as chief. His birth name was Fuerte, meaning strong or stout. After the massacre, after his retaliatory raids left the area around Santa Rita painted with Mexican blood, he earned a new name, Mangus Coloradas, red sleeves. The Mexican escalation backfired catastrophically. The Apache, particularly under Mangus, waged total war against northern Mexico. Between 1830 and 1850, the Mexican states of Chihuahua and Sonora lost an estimated 6,000 people to Apache raids. The Santa Rita copper mines were abandoned and would remain closed for 35 years. Entire towns were depopulated as residents fled in terror. But the Mexicans were not the Apache's only enemy. From the east came an even more terrible threat. In the late 1500s and early 1600s, the Apache had been the dominant power of the southern Great Plains. They controlled prime buffalo hunting grounds and practiced agriculture along the rivers. It was, as historian T.R. Fehrenbach wrote in his definitive book Comanches, A History of a People, the Best of Both Worlds. Then, in the middle of the 1600s, everything changed. The same Spanish horses the Apache had learned to ride reached another tribe, the Comanche. And the Comanche did not just adopt the horse. They became the horse. They bred them. They lived on them. They fought from horseback in ways no other tribe could match. The Comanche had been pushed to the least desirable lands by more powerful tribes, including the Apache. They remembered this humiliation. When they gained the horse, they took their revenge. Starting around 1706, Spanish records show that Apache bands began abandoning the plains in a panic. Reports came of mysterious invaders from the north, mounted warriors of terrifying skill and brutality. The Spanish couldn't understand what was happening. Apache settlements were found burned and empty. Entire bands vanished. The Farion, the Carlana, the Paloma Apache were exterminated, wiped from existence. The Spanish finally learned the identity of the attackers from the Utes, who called them the Comanche, those who are against me all the time, the Comanche. What followed was what the Spanish explicitly called a war of extermination. The Comanche purpose, as Thomas Britton writes in his book Lipan Apaches, people of wind and lightning, was always the same. Quote, to catch the Apache off guard at the rancherias, to make a sudden assault, kill as many Apaches as they could, capture some women and children for the slave trade in New Mexico, and plunder the rancherias and destroy the harvested crops. End quote. The Apache fought back fiercely. On foot, without their horses, they were more than a match for any Comanche warrior. But they could never catch the Comanche, who slept in a different place every night and could cover 400 miles in a week. And the Apache agriculture, their cornfields that had once been their strength, became their weakness. The Comanche knew exactly where to find them. By the 1720s, the Plains Apache had been driven entirely into the mountains of New Mexico and the deserts of the Southwest. The Lipan Apache, the last holdouts, were crushed in 1723 in a massive battle the Spanish called El Gran Cerro del Fierro. After several days of fighting, hundreds of Lipan warriors lay dead. The survivors, like all the other Apache bands, retreated to the mountains. In 1785, desperate and exhausted from fighting both the Comanche and the Spanish simultaneously, the Spanish finally achieved what they had been unable to do for a century. They made peace with the Comanche. The terms were simple. The Comanche would stop raiding Spanish settlements, trade would open between them, and together they would hunt down and destroy the Apache. Spanish General Juan de Ugalde led the combined forces. In January 1790, his army of Spanish soldiers, Comanche warriors, and Wichita allies trapped hundreds of Lipan Apache in a canyon west of San Antonio. The slaughter was total. When it ended, the Lipan had fewer than 1,000 warriors remaining. They, like all the other Apache bands, abandoned their last footholds on the plains and retreated permanently into the mountains. The Apache had lost half their territory. Thousands were dead. But in the rugged mountains of Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico, they could still survive. The Comanche horses gave them less advantage in that terrain. The Spanish and Mexicans rarely ventured deep into Apache strongholds. For a time, an uneasy equilibrium held. The Apache raided Mexico and took what they needed. Mexico occasionally sent punitive expeditions that rarely found their targets. The Comanche stayed on the plains. The Apache stayed in the mountains. Then the Americans arrived. In 1846, the United States went to war with Mexico. 2 years later, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo gave the United States the entire Southwest, including all of Apache territory. At first, the Apache welcomed this development. The Americans had no history with them, no blood feuds, no generational hatred, and crucially, the Americans were at war with Mexico, the Apache's hated enemy. For a few years, peace held. The Apache even allowed American wagon trains to pass through their territory unmolested. The California gold rush brought thousands of travelers west, and the Apache largely left them alone as long as they kept moving. But then, the Americans started staying. Gold was discovered in the Pinos Altos Mountains, in the heart of Chiricahua Apache territory. Miners flooded in, towns sprang up. The Apache complained that mining insulted Usen, their primary deity. The Americans ignored them. Tensions escalated. In January 1852, a small group of Apache were killed by American miners. The Apache retaliated, killing 3 Americans. One they tortured to death. They scalped him, something the Apache didn't traditionally practice, but had learned from the Mexicans, who paid bounties for Apache scalps. The victim had red hair. The Apache kept it as a trophy. Mangus Coloradas, now the most respected Apache chief, signed a peace treaty at Acoma with Colonel Edwin Sumner. He was the only chief willing to attend. The others believed it was a trap, but Mangus, even then, was thinking about the future. He wanted peace with the Americans. He got them to promise rations. He hoped this would reduce Apache raiding and allow his people to survive in this new world. For nearly a decade, the peace held. Barely. There were incidents, but nothing that couldn't be managed. Mangus even tried to lure American miners south into Mexico, telling them about gold deposits there, trying to move them out of Apache land without violence. Some settlers accused him of trying to trap them. They seized the old chief one day when he visited their camp. They tied him to a tree and whipped him with an ox whip until his back ran with blood. The Apache did not retaliate. Mangus Coloradas, at 70 years old, still believed peace with the Americans was possible. Still believed his people could survive if they just avoided giving the Americans a reason for war. Then came February 4th, 1861, a day that would change everything. The day Lieutenant George Bascom accused the wrong Apache of kidnapping a boy named Felix Ward. The boy's name was Felix Ward, though the Apache who took him would rename him Mickey Free. He was 11 years old when Cayotero Apache raiders swept through his family's ranch in the Sonoita Valley in January 1861. His stepfather, John Ward, returned home to find the boy gone and cattle stolen. He immediately rode to nearby Fort Buchanan and demanded the Army get his son back. Lieutenant George Bascom, young and inexperienced, led 54 soldiers east into the Chiricahua Mountain. He followed a trail heading toward Apache Pass, the same narrow canyon where Mangus would be shot the following year. Bascom assumed the trail meant the Chiricahua Apache were responsible. He was wrong. The Cayotero who took Felix had simply traveled through Chiricahua territory, but Bascom didn't know this, and he didn't care to find out. When he made contact with Cochise, the powerful Chiricahua chief and son-in-law of Mangus Coloradas, he demanded the boy be returned. Cochise agreed to meet him. On February 4th, Cochise walked into the American camp with several family members, including his brother and 2 nephews. He entered Lieutenant Bascom's tent in good faith. The Chiricahua had been at peace with the Americans. Cochise had no reason to expect trouble. Bascom accused him of taking the boy. Cochise said he didn't have the child, but offered to help find out which Apache band did. Bascom didn't believe him. He told Cochise he was now a prisoner and would be held until the boy was returned. Cochise had concealed a knife. In one fluid motion, he drew it and slashed through the canvas wall of the tent. He sprinted toward the mountains before the shocked soldiers could react. Bullets kicked up dirt around his feet. One grazed his body, but he made it to cover and disappeared into the rocks. His family was not so fortunate. The soldiers held them hostage. Over the next few days, Cochise captured several American travelers, hoping to trade them for his family. He sent messages to Bascom. He was willing to negotiate. He was willing to help find the boy. But Bascom, operating under orders, and perhaps his own stubborn pride, refused every offer. He would only accept the return of Felix Ward, a boy Cochise didn't have and couldn't produce. On February 8th, negotiations collapsed completely. Cochise, enraged and desperate, tortured his American captives to death. He left their mutilated bodies where the soldiers would find them. Bascom responded by hanging Cochise's brother and nephews. The Bascom Affair, as it became known, destroyed any chance of peace. Cochise rode to find Mangus Coloradas. The two most powerful Apache chiefs made a pact. They would drive the Americans from Apache territory entirely. They would show these invaders that the Apache were not Mexicans to be pushed around. They were not Comanche to be placated with treaties. They were Apache, and this was their land. What followed was a campaign of terror that shocked the American settlers. Cochise and Mangus united their warriors and struck at isolated ranches, mining camps, and wagon trains throughout southern Arizona and New Mexico. Near Cook's Canyon, south of the Pinos Altos Mountains, they killed over 100 Americans in a series of raids. The canyon earned a grim reputation. One Army commander wrote that it was, quote, sadly defaced with human bones and graves, end quote. The Apache didn't just kill, they sent messages. Cochise developed a particular method of execution for prisoners. He would hang them upside down about 18 inches above a small fire. Death took hours. The screams could be heard for miles. It was calculated brutality, designed to create terror, to make the Americans understand that staying in Apache territory came with a cost. The Americans responded in kind. In July 1862, Major General James Henry Carleton took command of military operations in New Mexico territory. Carleton was a hard man who believed in hard solutions. He instituted a new policy toward the Apache. Not negotiation, not containment. Extermination. His orders to his officers were explicit. Kill Apache wherever you find them. Take no prisoners unless specifically authorized. Drive them to starvation by destroying their food supplies, their horses, their camps. Make Apache land uninhabitable for Apache. It was this policy that would lead to the Apache's greatest military disaster and Mangus Coloradas' desperate gamble for peace. In July 1862, Cochise learned that a large American column was marching west through Apache Pass. The California column, commanded by General Carleton himself, was moving east to reinforce Union forces during the Civil War. To reach the pass, they would have to cross 40 waterless miles of desert. The only spring was at the abandoned stage station in the pass itself. Cochise saw an opportunity. He gathered approximately 200 warriors, including Mangus Coloradas and his Mimbres Apache. They would set an ambush at the spring. The Americans would be exhausted, desperate for water, vulnerable. The terrain favored the Apache completely. High rocks on both sides of the narrow canyon provided perfect cover. The Americans would be trapped below, easy targets. What Cochise didn't know was that these Americans were different from the small patrols and settler groups the Apache usually fought. This was a full military column, nearly 100 soldiers, well armed and well trained. And they had something the Apache had never seen before: howitzers, mountain artillery, 12-pound cannons that could be disassembled and carried by mules through rough terrain. On July 15th, the advance party of the California column approached Apache Pass. Captain Thomas Roberts commanded 95 men. They needed water badly. The July heat was murderous. Men and animals were near collapse. As they entered the canyon and approached the spring, the Apache opened fire from the rocks above. Bullets and arrows rained down on the soldiers. Roberts immediately ordered his men into defensive positions. They returned fire, but the Apache were nearly invisible among the rocks, firing and moving, impossible to target. The battle should have been over quickly. The Apache had overwhelming numerical superiority in the high ground, but Roberts had brought the howitzers. He ordered them unlimbered and aimed at the Apache positions. The first shells exploded against the rocks with devastating effect. The blasts shattered stone, sending deadly fragments tearing through Apache warriors who had thought themselves safe behind cover. The concussive force alone was enough to stun men unused to artillery fire. The Apache had never experienced anything like it. Bows and rifles, they understood. But these weapons that could destroy the very rocks that protected them, that exploded with thunder and fire, that killed men they couldn't even see? This was beyond their experience. They began to retreat. Warriors who had never fled from any fight abandoned their positions and fell back deeper into the mountains. But they didn't abandon the fight entirely. As the Americans secured the spring and began to fill their canteens, Cochise regrouped his forces. He would try again. That's when Mangus Coloradas made his fateful decision. He saw the battle turning against the Apache. He saw warriors falling to those terrible guns. He decided to charge forward on foot, leading by example, showing his warriors that the Americans could still be defeated at close range. John Teal, a soldier sent to warn approaching wagon trains about the battle, saw a giant of a man advancing through the Apache lines. Even among the Apache, who averaged around 5'6", this warrior stood out. Teal raised his rifle, took careful aim, and fired. The bullet struck Mangus Coloradas directly in the chest. The old chief fell. The Apache immediately rushed to him, abandoning the attack to carry their wounded leader to safety. They rode through the night 120 miles south to Llanos, Mexico, where they knew a doctor lived. They burst into his home before dawn. They laid Mangus on his table. They told the terrified Mexican doctor that if their chief died, everyone in Llanos would die. The doctor operated with a gun to his head. His hands, remarkably, were steady. He removed the bullet. Mangus survived. But the Battle of Apache Pass was lost. The Americans had their water. They had their victory. And they had proven that they possessed weapons against which Apache tactics were useless. Mangus Coloradas recovered slowly from his wound. As he healed through the late summer and fall of 1862, he watched American military power grow throughout the Southwest. More forts were built, more soldiers arrived. Carleton's extermination policy was put into action. Apache camps were burned, food supplies destroyed, warriors killed on sight. By winter, Mangus faced reality. The Apache could not win this war. Not against howitzers, not against the endless stream of American soldiers. Not against a government that had explicitly decided the Apache must be destroyed. In January 1863, against the advice of Cochise and other chiefs, Mangus Coloradas decided to approach the Americans under a white flag. He would negotiate. He would find a way for his people to survive, even if it meant surrender. He rode toward Fort McLean, toward Brigadier General Joseph West, toward his appointment with betrayal and death. The murder of Mangus Coloradas didn't end the Apache resistance. It guaranteed it would continue for another quarter century, and it guaranteed that when the Apache finally were defeated, it would only be after a campaign of extermination, more thorough and brutal than anything the Comanche or Mexicans had ever achieved. The Apache discovered what the Americans had done to Mangus Coloradas within days. His mutilated body, headless and scalped, left in a shallow gully like refuse. The warriors who found him wept. Some cut their arms and legs in mourning, gashing themselves until blood flowed freely. Others blackened their faces and wailed to the sky. Geronimo, the medicine man and warrior who had lost his own family to Mexican soldiers 5 years earlier, looked at the desecrated body of his chief and felt something break inside him. Years later, in his autobiography dictated to S.M. Barrett, he would call the murder of Mangus Coloradas, quote, perhaps the greatest wrong ever done to the Indians, end quote. But for the Apache, the desecration carried a meaning beyond murder. They believed the person enters the afterlife in the condition of their death. Mangus Coloradas, the greatest Apache war chief who had ever lived, would walk the spirit world forever without his head. His soul would wander incomplete through eternity. The rage that swept through the Apache bands was absolute and unifying. Chiefs who had disagreed with Mangus, warriors from bands that had feuded with the Mimbres, even Apache who had served as scouts for the Americans, all came together in their fury. The Americans had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. There would be no more talk of peace, no more trust in white flags or treaties. The war would be total, and the Americans were ready to match them. General James Henry Carleton wasted no time implementing his extermination policy. In the spring of 1863, he ordered Kit Carson, the legendary frontiersman and scout, to begin a systematic campaign against the Apache. The orders were explicit and brutal: burn their camps, destroy their food supplies, kill their horses, pursue them in winter when they were most vulnerable, give them no rest, no sanctuary, no mercy. Carson, despite his later fame and the romanticized versions of his life, carried out these orders with cold efficiency. His columns of soldiers and Apache scouts, yes, Apache scouts, warriors from bands willing to fight their traditional enemies, swept through Apache territory. They found a rancheria near the Gila River in January 1864. 21 Apache were killed, including women and children. The soldiers burned everything. Wickiups, supplies, dried meat stores that would have fed the band through winter. A soldier in Carson's command, whose diary was later published in the Journal of Arizona History, wrote of one such raid, quote, "We came upon them just after dawn, still sleeping. The fighting was over in minutes. Some tried to run, but the scouts were faster. We burned what we couldn't carry. Their winter provisions, all of it. They'll starve now if the cold doesn't take them first." End quote. This was the new reality. Not pitched battles where Apache tactics could prevail, but relentless pursuit, destruction of resources, warfare against the Apache ability to survive in their own land. Carleton called it, quote, "a steady, persistent, and ruthless campaign," end quote. He meant it, but the Apache were not the Navajo, who would eventually surrender to Carson and march to Bosque Redondo. The Apache knew their mountains too well. They had too many hiding places, too many springs and caches of supplies hidden in caves that soldiers would never find. They could endure hardship that would kill most men, and they could still raid. Throughout 1863 and 1864, Apache war parties struck back. They hit isolated ranches. They ambushed small military patrols. They stole horses and cattle, killed settlers, and disappeared into terrain the army couldn't follow. The raids were smaller now, more desperate, but they never stopped. The coordination between the United States and Mexico added a new dimension of horror to the conflict. For the first time, the two nations agreed to allow cross-border military operations against the Apache. Mexican forces could pursue Apache into American territory. American forces could pursue them into Mexico. The Apache, who had always used the border as a shield, found themselves trapped between two enemies working in concert. In Sonora and Chihuahua, the Mexican state governments renewed their scalp bounties: 100 pesos for a warrior's scalp, 50 for a woman's, 25 for a child's. But the Mexicans had learned from past mistakes. They no longer relied solely on mercenaries. They formed units of rurales, rural police forces, that functioned as paramilitaries, specifically tasked with hunting Apache. The most devastating blow came in October 1880 at a place called Tres Castillos in Chihuahua. Chief Victorio, who had taken up the fight after Mangus's death, led a band of Mimbres and Mescalero Apache, perhaps 150 people, including warriors, women, and children. They were running low on supplies. They were exhausted from months of pursuit by both American and Mexican forces. They made camp in a box canyon, thinking they were safe. Mexican Colonel Joaquin Terrazas surrounded them in the night with over 300 soldiers and Tarahumara Indian scouts. At dawn, the attack began. The Apache fought desperately, but they were trapped. The canyon walls that had seemed like protection became a killing ground. Rifle fire echoed off the rocks. Smoke filled the canyon. When the shooting stopped, 78 Apache lay dead, including Victorio himself. 68 more were captured, most of them women and children who would be sold into slavery. Only a handful escaped. A Mexican officer, writing in his official report later archived in Chihuahua State records, described the scene, quote, "The canyon floor ran red. They fought to the last bullet, the last arrow, and when they had nothing left, with knives and bare hands. We gave no quarter because we knew they would give none." End quote. The loss of Victorio was catastrophic. He had been one of the few remaining chiefs capable of uniting multiple Apache bands. With him gone, resistance became more fragmented, more desperate, more brutal on both sides. The reservation strategy added another layer to the extermination campaign. San Carlos, established in 1872 in eastern Arizona, became the concentration point for Apache from multiple bands. The Apache called it Hell's 40 Acres. The name was optimistic. It was much larger and much worse. The land was desert, alkaline, barely capable of supporting crops. Malaria-carrying mosquitoes bred in the stagnant pools along the Gila River. Temperatures in summer exceeded 110 degrees. The Apache, mountain people accustomed to pine forests and cool streams, suffered terribly in the heat. But the physical conditions were only part of the horror. Corruption ran rampant. Indian agents sold rations meant for the Apache and pocketed the money. When Apache complained, they were beaten or imprisoned. Disease swept through the crowded camps. Tuberculosis, malaria, dysentery, all took their toll. An Apache named Jason Betsinez, who survived San Carlos and later wrote the book I Fought with Geronimo, described the conditions. Quote, "We died there like flies in autumn. The children died first, then the old ones. We buried them in the rocky ground, and the coyotes dug them up." End quote. Population records from San Carlos, incomplete as they are, tell the story. In 1874, approximately 4,000 Apache were imprisoned there. By 1880, fewer than 3,000 remained. The missing 1,000 hadn't escaped. They had died. Disease, starvation, despair. This was extermination by reservation. Slower than bullets, but just as effective. It was from San Carlos that Geronimo would launch his resistance. He had been brought there in 1876 after years of raiding in Mexico. For a man who had known freedom his entire life, the confinement was unbearable. He tried to adapt. He planted crops. He drew rations. He followed the rules. For 2 years, he endured. Then, in April 1878, he led his first breakout. He took with him his family and a few dozen followers. They fled south into the Sierra Madre Mountains of Mexico, the wildest, most remote territory left to the Apache. There, in that rugged wilderness, they could still live as Apache had always lived. The army pursued them. Of course. They always did. But in the Sierra Madre, the Apache advantage was total. They knew every canyon, every spring, every trail. American soldiers, Mexican rurales, they all struggled in that terrain. Many never came back. Geronimo was eventually persuaded to return in 1880. He stayed at San Carlos for less than a year before breaking out again in April 1881. This time he took more followers, and he raided more aggressively. The pattern repeated: breakout, raids, pursuit, negotiation, return. In September 1881, he came back. By April 1882, he was gone again. Each time, the raids grew more violent. Each time, the military response grew more determined. By 1885, both sides had abandoned any pretense of restraint. Geronimo's final breakout came in May 1885. He left San Carlos with only 35 warriors, along with women and children, perhaps 140 people total. The reasons were complex. Some accounts say a medicine man had warned him of impending disaster. Others say he was drunk on Tiswin, Apache corn beer, and panicked. Geronimo himself later claimed that Mickey Free, the boy whose kidnapping had started the Bascom affair, now an Army scout, had arrested some Apache for drinking and beating their wives, and he feared more persecution. Whatever the reason, he fled, and the American response was overwhelming. General George Crook, who had pursued Apache for years and understood them better than most Army officers, mobilized 5,000 troops. A quarter of the entire United States Army was deployed to capture fewer than 40 Apache warriors. Additionally, 3,000 Mexican soldiers joined the hunt. Apache scouts, perhaps 200 of them, from bands willing to fight Geronimo, were recruited. The border between the United States and Mexico became meaningless as both nations coordinated their pursuit. Geronimo and his band moved like ghosts through the mountains. They traveled at night when possible. During the day, they hid in caves or dense vegetation, watching as army columns passed within yards of their positions. They could cover 70 miles in a day, moving through terrain that horses struggled to navigate. When their horses tired, they killed them. They butchered the meat, took what they could carry, and stole fresh horses from the next ranch they encountered. Then they ran again. Behind them, they left a trail of raided ranches, stolen livestock, and bodies. Estimates vary, but during that year and a half of freedom, Geronimo's tiny band may have killed as many as 500 Mexicans and dozens of Americans. The numbers are disputed and likely exaggerated, but the terror they created was real. Entire regions of Sonora and Chihuahua were effectively depopulated as residents fled to fortified towns. The pursuit was relentless. Captain Emmett Crawford, a skilled officer who had earned Apache respect, tracked Geronimo deep into Mexico. In January 1886, Crawford's Apache scouts found Geronimo's camp. They were preparing to attack when Mexican soldiers, also hunting Geronimo, stumbled upon Crawford's force. In the confusion, the Mexicans opened fire, believing the Apache scouts were Geronimo's warriors. Crawford was shot through the head. He died a week later. Geronimo, in the chaos, escaped again, but the noose was tightening. In March 1886, General Crook finally cornered Geronimo in the Sierra Madre. They met at a place called Cañon de los Embudos. Photographs exist of this meeting, showing Crook in his white canvas suit sitting across from Geronimo and his warriors. The Apache look exhausted, gaunt from months of running. Their faces are hard, their eyes wary, but they're still armed, still dangerous. Crook offered terms. Surrender and you'll be sent east for 2 years, then allowed to return to the reservation. Geronimo hesitated. His warriors argued among themselves. Some wanted to continue fighting. Others were tired, hungry, ready to give up. Geronimo agreed. They would surrender. But that night, a man named Triboulet, a whiskey trader, found the Apache camp. He told Geronimo that Crook had lied. The Apache would be hanged once they crossed the border. Triboulet wanted to keep selling whiskey to Apache raiders, and surrender didn't serve his business interests. Whether he believed his own lie or simply wanted to prevent peace, the result was the same. Before dawn, Geronimo fled with 38 followers, including warriors, women, and children. The rest of the Apache, already on their way to surrender, were captured and sent east to prison. Crook, humiliated by Geronimo's escape, was relieved of command. General Nelson Miles replaced him. Miles brought different tactics: fewer soldiers in massive columns, more small mobile units with Apache scouts. He also brought heliograph stations, mirror-based communication posts on mountaintops that allowed rapid coordination across vast distances. The technology was new, and it was effective. Geronimo could no longer move unseen. Sunlight flashing from mountain to mountain tracked his movements. By August 1886, Geronimo had been running for 15 months. He had covered thousands of miles. He had evaded or fought off dozens of engagements, but his band was down to only 24 warriors, plus women and children. They were exhausted, low on ammunition, and out of territory to run to. On September 4th, 1886, at Skeleton Canyon on the Arizona-Mexico border, Geronimo met with General Miles. This time, there would be no escape. Miles had surrounded the area with troops. Apache scouts loyal to the army made clear they would track Geronimo to the ends of the earth if necessary. Geronimo, the last free Apache war leader, looked at his remaining warriors. He looked at the women and children who had followed him through 15 months of hell. He knew it was over. In his autobiography, dictated years later, he described his thoughts, quote, "I looked in vain for General Crook, and I saw that the troops had surrounded us. My warriors were tired of fighting. The women and children were tired of running. I decided to surrender." End quote. But surrender brought no mercy. Miles lied to Geronimo. He promised the Apache would be reunited with their families, that they would be sent to Florida temporarily, then allowed to return to Arizona. None of this was true. All the Chiricahua Apache, not just Geronimo's warriors, but every Chiricahua, including those who had served as Army scouts, were rounded up and forced onto trains headed east. Nearly 500 people, warriors who had fought for the United States, women and children who had never left the reservation, all of them were sent into exile. The government had decided that the only way to end the Apache wars was to remove every single Apache from their homeland. The train journey to Florida took weeks. The Apache were packed into sweltering boxcars with inadequate food and water. Many fell ill. When they arrived at Fort Marion and Fort Pickens, the humid climate of Florida killed them faster than bullets ever had. Tuberculosis swept through the camps, malaria, dysentery. The Apache, mountain people accustomed to high, dry elevations, had no resistance to these diseases. Children died first, then the elderly. In the first year alone, 1/4 of the imprisoned Chiricahua died. Geronimo himself, the man who was told by the god Usen that he would never die in battle, survived. But many of those who had followed him, trusted him, fought beside him, did not. He would live the rest of his life as a prisoner. First in Florida, then in Alabama, finally at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. He would never see Arizona again. The war of extermination had finally succeeded. Not through military victory in the traditional sense, but through systematic destruction of the Apache ability to survive. Their land taken, their population decimated by disease and starvation, their leaders dead or imprisoned, their children sent to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak Apache or practice Apache culture, their very identity under assault. By 1900, of the 8,000 to 10,000 Apache estimated in 1850, perhaps 4,000 remained. The Lipan Apache, once rulers of the Texas Plains, were virtually extinct. The Mimbres band that Mangus Coloradas had led numbered in the dozens. The Chiricahua, Geronimo's people, were scattered in exile, dying in prisons far from home. Three empires, Spain, Mexico, and the United States, had waged war on the Apache for over 2 centuries. Each had called it necessary. Each had justified it differently. The Spanish claimed divine right. The Mexicans claimed self-defense. The Americans claimed manifest destiny and civilization. But the result was the same: an attempt to erase a people from the earth. Almost, but not quite, successful. The trains carrying the Chiricahua Apache east in 1886 marked the beginning of what should have been the final chapter of Apache history. The government's plan was simple and brutal. Remove them from their homeland. Imprison them where the climate and disease would do what the army couldn't. Wait for them to die out. For a time, it nearly worked. At Fort Marion in St. Augustine, Florida, the Apache were held in the old Spanish fortress. The thick stone walls that had protected conquistadors now became a prison. The humid air, so different from the dry mountain climate of Arizona, hung heavy and suffocating. Mosquitoes bred in the swamps. The water was bad. The food was worse. Within months, Apache began dying. An Army medical officer, whose report was later filed in the National Archives, wrote in 1887, quote, "The mortality rate among these prisoners is alarming. Tuberculosis is rampant. Pneumonia claims the children. The sanitary conditions are inadequate for this number of people confined in such close quarters. Without intervention, this population will be significantly reduced within 5 years." End quote. The intervention never came. The government didn't want them to survive. That was the point. Children were hit hardest. 112 Apache children were separated from their families and sent to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. The school's founder, Richard Henry Pratt, had a famous motto, quote, "Kill the Indian, save the man," end quote. The children were forbidden to speak Apache. Their hair was cut. Their traditional clothes burned. They were given English names and forced to wear uniforms. They were beaten for any sign of their culture. Of those 112 children, 30 died at Carlisle. Disease mostly. Tuberculosis, measles, pneumonia. Their bodies were buried in the school cemetery, thousands of miles from the mountains where they were born. Their families were not informed until months after the deaths. Asa de Kluge, the son of Chief Jew and nephew of Geronimo, survived Carlisle. Years later, interviewed by historian Eve Ball for her book In the Days of Victorio, he described what happened to the children. Quote, "They took us from the dry mountains and put us in a place where the air was thick and wet. They took us from our families and told us to forget we were Apache. Many of my friends died there. I watched them waste away, coughing blood, growing thin. The white doctors did nothing. I think they wanted us to die." End quote. The adult prisoners fared little better. In 1894, after 8 years in Florida and Alabama, the surviving Chiricahua, now fewer than 300 people, were moved to Fort Sill in Oklahoma. The conditions were marginally better, but they were still prisoners, still confined, still dying. Geronimo lived at Fort Sill for 15 years. He became something of a celebrity, the famous Apache warrior, now tamed and on display. He rode in Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade in 1905, wearing a top hat and waving to crowds who had once called for his extermination. He sold photographs of himself at exhibitions, signing them for tourists. He died in 1909 at nearly 80 years old, falling drunk from his horse into a creek, contracting pneumonia. On his deathbed, he was still angry, still bitter. An Apache interpreter named Cancia was present and later told the story to historian Angie Debo. Geronimo's last words were about Mexico. Quote, "I should never have surrendered. I should have fought until I was the last man alive." End quote. But even in death, the indignity continued. His grave at Fort Sill became a tourist attraction. In 1918, 9 years after his death, members of Yale's Skull and Bones Society allegedly robbed his grave and took his skull as a trophy. The Apache have demanded its return for over a century. Yale denies having it. It wasn't until 1913, 27 years after their surrender, that the Chiricahua Apache prisoners were finally freed. They were given a choice: stay at Fort Sill or go to the Mescalero Apache Reservation in New Mexico. Most chose Mescalero, desperate to return to their homeland, even if it wasn't exactly their original territory. Of the nearly 500 Chiricahua imprisoned in 1886, only 287 remained. Almost half had died in captivity. An entire generation of children had been lost. The language was fading. The old ceremonies were forgotten by many. The traditional way of life was impossible to resume. The other Apache bands suffered similar fates, though none were exiled as the Chiricahua were. The Mescalero, Jicarilla, and Western Apache remained on reservations in New Mexico and Arizona, but under conditions designed to destroy their culture. The Lipan Apache of Texas were reduced to a few dozen survivors scattered among other tribes. Some historians consider them functionally extinct as a distinct people. By 1900, the total Apache population across all bands was estimated at 4,000 to 5,000, down from 8,000 to 10,000 just 50 years earlier, a population reduction of 40 to 50%. In demographic terms, this qualifies as genocide. The extermination had nearly succeeded, but the operative word is nearly. Against all odds, some Apache survived. They held on to their language, their stories, their identity. They passed it to their children in whispers, in secret, when the government agents and missionaries weren't watching. They remembered the names of the chiefs: Mangus Coloradas, Cochise, Victorio, Nana, Geronimo. They remembered the mountains, the ceremonies, the old ways. And slowly, painfully, they began to rebuild. But the war of extermination left scars that would never fully heal. The missing generations. The lost territory. The children buried in Pennsylvania, in Florida, in Alabama, far from home. The head of Mangus Coloradas, still missing. Stolen for pseudoscientific racial theories that proclaimed Apache inferiority. The cultural knowledge that died with the elders who were killed or imprisoned before they could pass it on. Modern Apache historians and tribal leaders speak about this period with a mixture of pride and pain. Pride that their people survived what 3 empires tried to do to them. Pain for what was lost and can never be recovered. Mildred Cleghorn, the first chairwoman of the Fort Sill Apache tribe, who died in 2009, once said in an interview archived by the Oklahoma Historical Society, quote, "My grandparents told me stories about the old days, about running through the mountains, about being free. Then they told me about the trains east, about watching their friends die in Florida. They told me these things so I would never forget. So I would teach my children. So the Apache would survive," end quote. Survival. That became the victory. Not defeating the Americans or the Mexicans, not keeping their land or their way of life. Simply surviving, refusing to disappear, refusing to be erased. The war of extermination was meant to wipe the Apache from history, to make them a footnote, a conquered people who couldn't adapt to civilization and were therefore eliminated. For a time, it seemed the plan would work. But here's what the architects of extermination didn't understand. You can kill warriors. You can imprison populations. You can steal children and forbid languages. You can do all of this, and the Apache will still be Apache. Because Apache identity wasn't just about territory or raids or warfare. It was about endurance, about surviving in impossible conditions, about adapting without surrendering core identity, about passing knowledge through generations despite every attempt to stop it. The very skills that made the Apache the most elusive warriors in history, the ability to survive on nothing, to hide in plain sight, to endure suffering that would break other people, those same skills saved them from complete extermination. By the mid-20th century, Apache populations began to slowly recover. The language, nearly lost, was taught again. The ceremonies, practiced in secret for decades, were performed openly. The reservations remained. Poverty remained. The legacy of trauma remained. But so did the Apache. Today, there are approximately 63,000 enrolled members of Apache tribes across Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. The Fort Apache, San Carlos, Mescalero, Jicarilla, and Fort Sill Apache tribes are all federally recognized. They have their own governments, their own schools, their own police forces. They run casinos and cattle operations. They teach their children the language and the stories. They remember the war of extermination. They remember Mangus Coloradas, headless and dishonored. They remember the trains to Florida. They remember the children who died at Carlisle. They remember all of it. And they're still here. The war of extermination against the Apache lasted over 2 centuries. 3 empires participated. Spain with its missions and presidios. Mexico with its scalp bounties and slavery, the United States with its howitzers and prison trains. Each justified their actions differently, but the goal was always the same: the elimination of the Apache as a people. They nearly succeeded. Walk through any history of the American West, and you'll find chapters on the Plains Wars, on Custer's Last Stand, on the Trail of Tears. The Apache Wars, if they're mentioned at all, are footnotes. A paragraph about Geronimo's surrender, maybe a mention of Cochise. The systematic attempt to erase the Apache from existence has itself been nearly erased from popular memory. This erasure is not accidental. It's uncomfortable to acknowledge that the United States, along with its neighbors, waged a war explicitly described by its own generals as extermination. It's uncomfortable to remember that Apache children were taken from their families and left to die in boarding schools thousands of miles from home. It's uncomfortable to know that the head of Mangus Coloradas, severed and boiled, was shipped to a phrenologist to prove Apache inferiority and has never been returned. But discomfort doesn't change truth, and the truth is that what happened to the Apache meets every definition of genocide: cultural genocide, physical genocide, the deliberate destruction of a people. Yet here's the part that the architects of extermination didn't anticipate: the Apache refused to die. They were driven from the plains by the Comanche. They survived. They were hunted by Mexican bounty hunters who took their scalps and enslaved their children. They survived. They faced the full might of the United States Army, a quarter of which was deployed to hunt down fewer than 40 warriors. They survived. They survived disease in the prisons of Florida. They survived the forced assimilation of boarding schools. They survived poverty and neglect on reservations designed to fail. They survived every attempt to make them disappear. This survival wasn't inevitable. It required extraordinary resilience. It required elders who whispered stories to children in languages they were forbidden to speak. It required families who held on to ceremonies in secret. It required a stubbornness, a refusal to surrender identity even when everything else had been taken. That stubbornness, that refusal to be erased, is perhaps the greatest victory in Apache history. Not the raids or the battles or the last stands, but simply this: they're still here. The mountains of Arizona and New Mexico still stand. The wind still blows through the pines, and Apache people still walk those mountains, still speak their language, still tell the stories of Mangus Coloradas and Cochise and Victorio and Geronimo, still teach their children what it means to be Apache. The war of extermination failed. Not because the Apache won in any traditional sense. They lost their land, lost their way of life, lost thousands of their people, but they didn't lose themselves, and that made all the difference. Thanks for watching Valor and Violence. If this story moved you, if you learned something you didn't know about the Apache Wars, share this video. These stories need to be told. The attempted erasure of the Apache is part of American history, uncomfortable as it is. If you want to learn more about the Apache conflicts, check out our video on the Comanche War of Extermination that drove the Apache from the plains in the 1700s. It's another chapter in this long story of survival against impossible odds. And if you have questions, or if you know other untold stories from the Apache Wars, leave them in the comments below. History isn't just what's written in textbooks. It's what we choose to remember and pass on. The head of Mangus Coloradas was never found. His people have searched for over 160 years. They want to bury it properly, to give their greatest chief the dignity that was stolen from him in death. Maybe someday it will be returned. Maybe someday that wound will heal. Until then, the Apache remain, unbroken, undefeated in the ways that truly matter. The war of extermination was meant to erase a people. Instead, it revealed a people impossible to erase.